Welcome, Internet, to Psychoanalytic Talk. And today I wanted to talk about something that might be a little more off topic or off brand for this channel, but I just wanted to express it because I find that it's an interesting concept. So, the concept I want to talk about today is symbolic payment. And what is symbolic payment? So, it's basically when the patient does not have enough money to afford a session or a couple of sessions. So payment is not going to be done with money, but with something symbolic. That symbolic payment can be anything from a drawing, a painting, a sculpture. It can also be a poem. It can be so many things. The imagination can run wild with it. The whole point of symbolic payment, I think it's a concept that kind of has vanished. At least I never heard about it in my psychoanalytic daily life. And I think it's because it's also a very hard to implement concept. Because first and foremost, there is this idea that basically symbolic payment is really worth something, both for the therapist and for the patient? Is it something that can be really used? Is it putting the patient in debt? There's so many questions that can arise with the idea of symbolic payment that I think it's important to discuss it. Of course, I'm not going to state things as truth, but more of what I think. So what do I think about symbolic payment? So I think to an extent, it's a good sin. So I have to preface this by saying that, at least in a private practice, it might be different for everyone, but I think that psychotherapy should not start with symbolic payment. Why is that? It's because basically, if you start with symbolic payment, there is that idea that basically the therapy isn't worth money, it's worth something else, it's worth creativity. And that can be a good thing, but for a lot of patients, unfortunately, they can have the feeling that it devalues the work, and that can be an important setback, or that the work would be worthless because you're not paying real money for it. And some of them can have the sensation of virtually having monopoly money, meaning a fake kind of money, a fake type of transaction. So there is a risk in it. So that's why I think that one should not start with symbolic payment. Of course, this is overgeneralization, right? I'm no one, literally, to tell you what to do. This is just me just telling what I think, what I feel, and how I believe things to be. This is not a truth, all right? So I think that symbolic payment, however, has its whole place within a therapeutic relationship that has been established. Meaning someone you've seen many months, sometimes years, falls on hard times, meaning that they, for X or Y reason, they lose employment, they can't pay you, they have debts. Life is so vast that I can't elaborate on every single situation possible. But what you have to know is basically some people just at some point just lack the finances to keep going. And for certain people, a break can be discussed with the therapist, like, for now we have to stop, but we will take back where we left off once you fall on better times. And often the patient is completely fine with that the relationship is on pause, just a time for the patient to get back on his feet. There's no real problem with that. And if it's done well enough, patient is not going to even feel it as an abandonment. He's just going to say, well, it's on pause, and I will go back to it when I can. And that's fine also. However, there are a certain select group of patients who, if they do not have psychotherapy, are gonna undergo often a massive breakdown. So this massive breakdown, which I'm talking about, is not necessarily binded to psychopathology. I mean, it's not only psychotic, it's not only borderline, it can be everyone. How I see things is some people do need psychotherapy in their daily lives in order to just be able to stay afloat, even mentally. And I think that for some people, it can be so destructive to lose this grounding phenomena of being with the therapist, of having that time once a week, twice a week, and that there are true risk of psychic breakdown. So in these cases, and if the relationship has been long lasting, I think that symbolic payment is a real asset, because instead of just cutting it off, which would be completely detrimental, you can say, well, from now on, for I don't know, let's say a month, 2 months, each time we see each other, you'll be paying symbolically. Of course, you have to explain the rules. That symbolic payment is still payment. These sessions are still worth something, both mentally for the therapist and for the patient. And of course, that worth is what we find in money, but not just, because it's also the investment. And what is an investment? It's an investment of time, of energy, of course, finances, and of patience. And that's what psychoanalysis at its core is. It's an investment. And that investment can be shifted in another direction, which is symbolic payment. And that symbolic payment, for me, is full of meaning, because patients are going to pay you when they pay symbolically with a lot of things. They might show you something of their past. They might come up with something creative. They might produce material, psychic material that you're going to then be able to use together in the scope of the sessions. And it's going to make things go forward also, like normal payment would in these contexts. However, I have to also stretch that you have to see if it's economically viable for you, for the therapist, because all of this is like in a quote unquote an ideal financial situation for the therapist. So if you're struggling, or if the therapist is struggling, it might not be a good idea, because the therapist has to always be able to sustain himself or herself, and through that self-sustainingness, they can then be relaxed enough to help out as many patients as they can. However, if there's a massive stress, symbolic payment might not even be an option for the therapist. But when it is, and let's be honest, there's quite a number of therapists for who it is, and it could be an option. It can be interesting, and it can be an alternative to having patients break down, or having to go in hospitals, or having to feel abandoned. It can be an option rather than just, letting things break down, having the relationship fade away. Because the relationship patient-therapist is really a bedrock. And the more I work with people, the more I realize that the relationship itself has a fundamental transformative power. And if it's not there, even though patients with good enough organization might not need it, but people who have more difficulties will need it. And for those people, it's important to maintain it. Even, it doesn't have to be like 3 times a week symbolic payment, right? It can be once every 2 weeks, once a month, but the core relationship is what needs to be saved at that moment, for the patient to be able to still have something to go back to. That relationship isn't just greed-based or money-based, because there's also those fantasies. And in a normal context, of course, the patient might think that of the therapist, that he's greedy because he asks for so much money. Well, all that can be analyzed, but symbolic payment is there to save the bond at the disparaging, at the moment where the therapist and the patient both feel that it might collapse, and the patient will collapse if he doesn't have that. That being said, I have to also warn you that some patients might know about this and might try and bargain their way to symbolic payment. And it's really up to you to see if it's more an act of, of manipulation. I'm not saying manipulation in this quote unquote stupid evil way, but more like trying to play and get everything for themselves rather than really accept the frame of the therapy, because that's important. So it's something that you need to be sure about when you're offering it. But however, I think that unfortunately it has lost favor for so many reasons. Perhaps also because patients might find it difficult to understand the value of symbolic payment, or at least at the beginning of that process. But it's still, I think, a necessary and interesting tool to have in one's arsenal of therapy, because I think that often, unfortunately, sins degrade themselves, and we are often in situations where sins become complicated for everyone. But I think that the patient therapist relationship and its preservation for some people is not just an asset or something that's positive, it's necessary. And in that necessity, there's a way of keeping the frame of psychotherapy, meaning that you need to invest, because that's the whole point of the money. Symbolically, it represents an investment, but that investment can be found through symbols, through works of art, through creations of the patient that is going to give to the therapist. And that's also a way of investing oneself into the process. So I hope I did a good enough overview. Of course, as I said earlier, this is not the truth. This is a way of seeing things, and something that I think should always be presented as a kind of last resort for therapists to try and see if something needs to be saved and how to preserve it. Of course, that's not to be said that therapists are God or good doers, because they're not. They're just human. So it might not always be possible, or it might not even be advisable, even in the cases I've stated. However, I just think that it's important to have an alternative in mind and have an extra option if ever it might be needed. Anyway, I'm not gonna last any longer on this topic. I think I've said everything I wanted to say, and I'll see you in the next one.